All right, let's check to make sure everything is going correctly. Be kind of embarrassing if it wasn't. All right, let's see, just make sure my audio is working the way I think it is. There it is. Cool. All right. Hello, everyone. This is John from Incendium RPGs, and today we are taking a look at Playtest Packet number 3 from Kobold Press's formerly known as Project Black Flag, now known as Tales of the Valiant or Core Fantasy Role-Playing. I don't really know. But yeah, actually, it's interesting. I was actually listening to the Ghostfire podcast, and I kind of agree with them that kind of like how 5th edition originally wasn't called 5th edition, and eventually the company just kind of yielded once enough of the community referred to it as such. I don't see a problem just calling this the Valiant system. I think Tales of the Valiant is a little bit too much of a mouthful. But anyway, so Playtest Packet 3, instead of player options, which have been, if I was being most kind, hit or miss, largely miss, Playtest Packet 3 is instead giving us a look at the monster design. Now, in terms of my personal use of Kobold Press material, I don't really use their player options. In fact, I think besides, Tyranny of Dragons, the only Kobold Press thing I've really got on my shelf over there is the Creature Codex. And in general, I have used monsters from the Creature Codex. I think that in terms of like the monster design and how it interacts with player characters, that's where I initially had some more trust with Kobold Press. Seeing the playtest, the basically Kobold Press version of the Battle Master, I unfortunately am not as impressed as I would like to be. Not that I think weapon mastery is. I've had some time to think about the 1D&D playtest, listening to other content creators, reading other people's opinions on Reddit, and I do think that weapon mastery as a system is a step in the right direction. But I think that there needs to be something more, but that's not our thing for today. Today we're looking at Valiant. So, this is not going to be a purely live reaction. I have skimmed this document already, and I still think it's going to be fun to see what all of you think about this design. So, in terms of the stat block breakdown, a lot of this looks familiar. We've got the size category. I think the creature types are the same. So, you've got like Fae, Fiends, that kind of thing. I'm not sure how close these descriptions are to what's already in the SRD, but just reading them, how do you really describe a Fae? Like, magical creatures bound to the forces of nature. To me, that's a pretty good way to distinguish them from fiends who dwell in lower realm outside of measurable or material reality. So, and then, of course, there's a thing on modifying creatures, because even at the end of the day, when I run things, even out of the Creature Codex, I rarely run monsters rules as written. Of anything in the game, they're the thing that I feel can be the most malleable in terms from an encounter building perspective. That may clash with some philosophies of other GMs, but I've always found that, all of a sudden, like, if my creature just storytelling wise isn't accomplishing what is going to be best for the table, even if it's counter to what I've prepared, giving them like a new kind of ability or removing abilities can be a great way to, after seeing how they're initially being received by my players, being able to be a little more malleable with them can lead to the best possible gameplay. A good example of that is actually in one of my latest sessions, I had this group of bandits, and the idea is that they were stronger than normal bandits because they had discovered this ancient military cache of weapons. And because they had these like gauntlets and all this magical equipment, they were tougher than normal bandits. Now, the reason I had imagined it like this is my players are now 11th level. I figured, using CR 1/8 bandits was not going to be very fun. So instead, I had designed the stat block where they had like an AC of 20 and they had like 50 something hit points, because in my head it's like, well, maybe the armor that they wear gives them like a magic shield. So the bandits don't have a lot of hit points, but you're basically fighting against the equipment that they're wearing. And then my players very smartly figured that out and then tried to ambush the bandits before they could run and go get on their equipment. And because of that, I played them like normal bandits. I actually depowered the enemies I prepped, and my players had more fun and told me that that was a much more exciting way to go about that encounter. So modifying creatures is definitely something I think is something most GMs can keep in mind. Even modifying them on the fly is where I've found my table has the most fun with them. Now, what I do think is different is not only do we get creature types, but we get creature tags. So this is where like an animal is maybe a little different than, say, a beast, although it is not of the beast type but shares characteristics with them. So that's interesting. So what would they be if they're not of the beast type? Angel is a specific kind of celestial. I love tag systems. I think that any TTRPG could use more of them, mainly because they help you organize your content a little easier, and especially for search databases like D&D Beyond, where the speed of your game can be smoothed out with certain tool sets. I think tags are a very smart thing, and they allow you to more easily add on to the game. So I've always been interested that, in my experience, I haven't found anyone that's like added creature types to 5e with a supplementary product. So yeah. And then, we've got the usual thing: armor class, hit points, speeds. Unlike most creatures, monsters with the swim speed don't make melee attacks at disadvantage. Oh, yeah. So just basically some little nuggets of wisdom that is pretty intuitive, but I'm always a fan of, even if something seems intuitive, like, still point it out, because you never know when someone's going to get confused. Now, one thing I do think that's very interesting is that there is a passive stealth score added to each of these stat blocks. We'll get to it a little bit in a second, but I do find that the thing I really like about this playtest packet is, unlike the player options, which just seemed kind of unbalanced, and to me, you need the tightest balance for player options, because that's going to be the thing that sets up the interpersonal real world relationship dynamics between your players. Monsters can be strengthened and weakened on the fly, and you as the GM making adjustments to the monsters to have the most fun with your players, they can be more malleable. Players all of a sudden getting a huge increase or decrease in power, that's where, a lot of big feelings can come about. So one of the things I really like about this is how functionally these stat blocks are easily used by GMs. So the proficiency bonus, like we saw in Mordenkainen's Monsters of the Multiverse, are clearly laid out, so the calculations aren't as hidden. Something I did notice that I thought was kind of interesting is just reading through immunity, resistance, and vulnerability work as they always have. But they actually changed the damage types a little bit. Again, something that's kind of interesting. So on an initial look through, I didn't really notice anything besides that Psychic is missing and Void is added. I'm not sure the reason for that. Like, unlike the creature types, maybe it's somewhere else. Maybe it's in one of the other playtest packets, but I think it's kind of interesting that they don't explain what void damage means. So if, you find it in playtest packet 1 or 2, let me know, like, put it here. But, yeah, so vulnerability takes double damage. So behind the curtain, So the presentation is altered in the way it appears in 5e. There are no longer multiple lines that separate out damage and condition. So, for example, if a creature is immune to fire damage and the charmed condition, both appear in the immune line. This streamlines the information contained in stat blocks. Kinds of damage are listed first in alphabetical order, followed by conditions. If both are present, they're separated by a semicolon. I don't know if I really like that. I don't think that there's always this careful balance between streamlining and clarity, right? So a lot of times if something becomes streamlined, it can become more clear. But in a case like this where there are two separate categories of information, conditions and damage, personally, I would like that to be separated, where there's like condition immunities, damage immunities, rather than lumping it all in together. So this one I thought was also kind of, so keen is a little different than, say, blind sight, which was kind of a confusing name. And it's like, if you have an ability that relies on line of sight, does a creature with blind sight still see them? So monsters primarily perceive the world by sight. This is called vision. Stupid. I'm sorry. So yeah, monster that has no unusual sensory capacity is marked with just a dash. So a monster with keen senses can precisely perceive its surroundings using some other sense than vision. Creatures without vision, like oozes, morlocks, typically have this sense. If a monster lacks vision entirely, a parenthetical phrase on its senses line confirms that the radius of this sense defines the monster's maximum range of perception. So, yeah, so I wonder how much, creatures with echolocation, such as bats, wolves, and true dragons. So yeah, maybe that's a better way to put, blind sight. So, all right, and then you get perception. Excuse me 1 second. All right. So we also get some new languages down here, which again, I kind of, rather than having like default like species-based languages, I do like it when the worlds I create have more region-based languages. So it doesn't matter if you're a goblin. Goblins don't have their own language as much as like this region has its own language and this region has a different language. So if you're a goblin from two different regions, you may speak two different languages, just like people from our world. So that way it like kind of overcomes the assumption that the world's regions are like separated by species. So like the dwarves all live over here. It still leaves the space for creating that kind of world, like a Lord of the Rings type world, but it doesn't like start the players expecting that's how, languages work in your world. That being said, machine speech. I actually have one in my world that's like beast speech. So, or it's called grunt speak, because it's almost like Pokemon where all the beast folk races can basically like grunt and understand each other. So it's like Squirtle, Squirtle, but like Bulbasaur would still understand what the Squirtle is trying to say. So I do think that this is a neat idea that, I haven't done it with machines or constructs, but it is kind of an interesting way to go about it. So, all right, let's see what they have to say on challenge rating. Tells you how great it is. Oh, good. It's still 4 PCs should be able to defeat a monster with a CR equal to their level without suffering any deaths. So same kind of system as 5th edition. All right. Go easy at first level. Yeah, I've always found that kind of interesting that the game is actually like hardest at first level because your characters have the least survivability. So I just think it's kind of interesting that like in a lot of ways the game gets easier the higher in level you go, whereas I don't know, when I play JRPGs, it tends to be that the lower the level you are, the easier the game is. And then as the game adds in more mechanics and gets more complicated, it gets tougher. So it's something to keep in mind with TTRPGs, especially ones based off of 5th edition system, is what does the difficulty curve of your game look like? And what would you want it to look like? So there's acknowledging what it is, but what could it be? So now the other big one is doom points. So during combat, you can spend a doom point to give a monster advantage on a single attack or force a PC to roll a save with disadvantage. Some monsters have additional ways to spend doom points. This is, not with this language, but this kind of design is something I've actually been using in my games for a while. One of the mechanics I hate so much is legendary resistance, and that's being on both sides of the screen. There was, there was a game, I remember sitting back and thinking, why are we arguing so much now? Like, when we were 5 levels ago, when we were at like level 7 or 8, my players were having a blast with combat. They were having so much fun. Now that we're like level 15 or 16, all of a sudden they're spending a lot of time trying to argue with me, why didn't that save work? And I have to explain legendary resistance to them. And it just always, like, whenever I would run legendary resistance, it would always feel like, oh, you want to try to do a cool thing? Not gonna happen. And I understand there's like a game balance thing. This was one way the designers tried to go about it. And I don't like that they just automatically succeed the save. Magic resistance can be annoying, but there's still a chance that your spell could go off no matter how low those chances are. If you're so afraid of somebody like getting stopped by a polymorph or a charm condition or paralysis, just give your monster immunity to that. Like, the thing that really got me was, I think it was the Skull Lord from one of the other books. Maybe it was Tome of Foes. It's in Multiverse too. But, like, the Skull Lord had legendary resistances and immunities to, like, everything. So I remember trying to stunning strike it, and it was like, nope, it's immune to stun. So, if you give your creatures too many defenses, then you're just asking that the players only do damage and stop thinking about all of their fun storytelling spells. So, and then people wonder why you don't have a lot of, different characters that show up at the table. My point being that if doom points are tied to legendary resistance, so it's like, all right, I could use this for legendary resistance, or I could use my doom points to, I don't know, to roll an attack with advantage or something, and maybe that triggers a sneak attack like feature. That could be a cooler way to do it. So having this separate resource pool, I actually think can be helpful, especially for single boss encounters that traditionally get out action economied by clever players. So anyway, we'll see how they actually implement it in the game. Now, one thing that we'll get into is that the default stat blocks do not use random damage, so there's a table here for that. I'm not necessarily a fan of this whole method, but we'll get into it. And I think for the most part, grapple rules for monsters. Oh, let's look at this. Many monsters have attacks that allow them to quickly grapple prey. When a monster hits with such an attack, it doesn't need to make an additional check to determine whether the grapple succeeds. A creature grappled can use its action to try to escape with an athletics or acrobatics check against the escape DC. If no escape is given, assume it's 10 plus the monster's strength. Alright, and then we get legendary actions, another thing my players love, and then layer actions. So yeah, so the design is very similar. Excuse me. But it is, there are some slight variations. So let's take a look at some of these monsters. So right at CR1, we've got animated armor. First thing I noticed off the bat, vulnerability and resistance is an actual thing. I I can't believe how many creatures don't have, like, resistances or vulnerabilities in 5e's SRD. I think they've kind of added more over time. Like, I remember the Frost Salamander is vulnerable to fire. But for a mechanic that adds so much interesting interaction, like, it is super underutilized. So yeah, here we get an example of immune, poison, void, blinded, charmed, deafened. So one thing that I will say, I'm kind of about, there are no hit dice in the stat blocks anymore. I actually think this is a good thing. I think it makes it easier to see, just how many hit points are it. And if you want to randomize it a little bit, just play with the numbers. The designers have said, when you see something that says like 1d100 days or something, that's code for however much you want to put in anyway. So just modify it. Like, the whole having to follow the hit dice exactly, I've never really bought into that type of design. So anti-magic susceptibility. Now here's where we get into, it just deals 7 damage. It doesn't... Actually, let's go back to that random thing. So yeah, if the damage is 7, this is what the damage die should come out to be. So it would be 1d12. I gotta be honest, this is the one part where I actually prefer to roll damage with dice rather than having a consistent static amount. For most of these things, like having a static stealth score, having a static perception, I think those things speed up gameplay. But when it comes to damage and attacks, that's where I actually like having a little bit more variability. And that's a very personal thing. So if they're interested in showing the average, because I don't know, actually comment if you use the average when it comes to monsters or if you roll the dice. I like rolling the dice. I think that it does add some excitement for my players. I also roll in the open, so like my players can see, wow, this guy, rolled a 19 on his attack roll, but he got like 2 1s on the damage die. I think that for the personal experience that I like at my tables, this is something that tends to be used. So yeah, so taking a look at some other things. I will say the other thing I like, which is a good point, the SRD has no lore in there. They just give you monster stat blocks with no context. And especially for what the purpose of the SRD is, which is to create your own content, I think that is fine. But if Valiant, their core fantasy role-playing system, is going to give you a little bit more lore, which does kind of conflict with the whole make your own thing, excuse me, I do think that it can, I don't know which method I like more. Honestly, I kind of like the SRD method a little more, but the one thing I can say about doing it like this, where it says a bugbear is a hirsute, I don't even know what that word means, hirsute brown-furred humanoid with dark eyes and elongated ears, wielding a massive heavy spiked club. This shows you how to templatize if you want to create your own world, which is something I'm interested in. It's definitely a far along project. I want to see what the Orc license and the 1D&D Creative Commons license looks like first, but this is actually, I like templates. So this is a nice template of how to maybe do it if you want to create something using the Valiant system. So, named for their alien appearance. What doesn't have an alien appearance? It gives something about their behavior and their tactics. I will say, especially when it comes to my humanoids, I don't like things like this. I don't like when you assume what their behavior is like based on their species. But, again, template. So how would you use this stat block? Be a sneaky combatant. One thing I will say is if you've purchased or seen the blog, The Monsters Know What They're Doing, where Keith Amon, goes through, this creature has a +3 strength and a +2 dex. here's how to use it purely mechanically in the game. I think that offering that kind of mechanical guidance would be really helpful for GMs to facilitate their games. So, and this is a good example of there's the humanoid creature type and the goblinoid tag. So, and then it's got some things. Yeah. So let's take a look. Oh, and it gives an example of a bugbear champion too. That's kind of interesting. Now, I could also, especially if you just kind of switch out Void with Psychic, this can be, excuse me, one of the praises I can give the Valiant system is that for the most part, it's pretty compatible with 5th edition as it exists. And since, 1D&D is really just 5th edition, ideally it'll be somewhat compatible with that system as well. So, seeing, I'm not sure I would, depending on what Valiant's player's handbook options look like, I'm not sure I would be super into that, but I could see myself picking up their monster manual, or, since they're releasing a lot of this for free, just looking at the free content. The Crimson Jelly. Very cool. This does not have any vulnerabilities. Alright, so far we've seen one creature with a vulnerability. The Husk Demon doesn't have it either. So Void Drain, so it deals void damage. Cool. Alright. Let's take a look at, do we have, what do we got for Red Dragon? Red Dragon Hatchling, Young Red Dragon, Adult Red Dragon. Alright, here we go. So, let's take a look at, because, it's not Dungeons and Dragons, but dragons are in the name Dungeons and Dragons. So the mighty red dragons are one of the most feared variety of dragons, powerful, intelligent, and cunning. Their attacks rend armor. Their flaming breath devastates anyone foolish enough to stand against them. Older red dragons develop additional attacks and even the ability to cast spells. So, if we look at this, a red dragon favors high mountains, snowy peaks, fuming volcanoes, or sprawling ancient ruins. So if we're looking at the layer actions, on initiative count 20, losing initiative ties, can take the following layer actions. So collapse, a 20-foot square of earth collapses. Creatures in the area must succeed on a DC 16 dex save or take 15 bludgeoning damage. A pinned creature, or another creature within 5 feet of it, can make a DC 15 strength check, freeing the restrained creature on a success. These layer actions are a little bit cooler. Sometimes the other layer actions are kind of lame. But these are kind of cool. Swirling Ash, Conflagrate, and regional effects. So there's Acid Rain. Nasty. So looking at the adult red dragon, does it say which of these dragons actually has a layer, or it just says this is what a layer is like? I think it just says this is what a layer is like. But yeah, an adult red dragon is evil again. I think alignment's a little outdated, but yeah, so it starts with 3 Doom points, which it can expend to use standard Doom options or the Elemental Roar action. So going over here, the dragon emits an ear-splitting roar that curses creatures with elemental chaos. Each creature within 500 feet and able to hear the roar must make a charisma save or be cursed for a minute. While cursed, it has vulnerability to fire damage. A creature that has resistance to fire damage instead loses it for the duration. A creature can repeat the save at the end of its turns, ending the effect on a success. It's kind of interesting. So like opening up with Elemental Roar and then maybe using a layer. Was one of these layer actions to do fire damage? Yeah, the Swirling Ash to hit you. It's not a lot of fire damage, but still, that'd be a way to open a fight. And then it can use its Terrifying Presence followed by a bite and 2 claw attacks, and the bite attack can also do damage. And charisma saves, those aren't super common. And you don't have like a lot of characters that I think would be really good at charisma saves off the top of my head. You know, standard 5th edition would be sorcerers, warlocks, paladins. So yeah, that can be pretty nasty, especially a DC 21. Basically, unless you're playing a charisma character, it's gonna be pretty unlikely that you're gonna make that save. So yeah, that's pretty nasty. I'm into it. So void dragons drift through empty spaces. Void dragons are intensely knowledgeable. All right. Oh, and we only get a young void dragon though, and it doesn't have any doom points. So ghouls. All right, one thing I do like, and I don't think they say this, I think they say Constitution saving throw. I do like how they're using the 3-letter abbreviation, so DC 13 con save, because it draws the I a little bit easier. One of the things I really like, it used to like frustrate me more when I was first like DMing and stuff, but was when players would be unable to separate flavor text from mechanics text. So, you know, it'd be like I'd ask them to, you know, tell me what kind of save their spell does, especially if it was a weird spell. And they would start with swirling vines erupt from the ground, and it's like, no, I don't need that part. Is it strength or dex? Like, which of those two? And they would have a hard time just quickly looking at a wall of text to let me know what I need to do in order to keep the game moving. So I will say that this format of, you know, DC con save, it draws the eye, and I think is helpful in keeping things moving. This is an interesting one, the bonus action bite attack. We've had 10 years now to learn what we like about 5th edition and what we think needs changing. I don't think enough creatures utilize bonus actions. Largely, I don't think they really need to, but that is interesting to see that here for the ghoul. The other thing is, I haven't even mentioned this, the ability scores. You only get the modifier. That's something I can't think really of a lot of things that, especially in combat, when you would need to know a creature's like just straight ability score for. I can't think of like there are things like, you know, they need to make a wisdom save or something, but it's not like, you know, if their wisdom score is 15 versus 16 besides the modifier, you know, like I've never really had that come up. So even in my home prep, if I'm going to customize a monster, this is how I would format it. I wouldn't, you know, have all their proficiencies laid out or anything. Not unless it was really relevant. I would have, you know, what the modifiers are, perception, senses, and I would kind of organize it like this. Yeah, I do. Maybe this is all right. The whole the damage and conditions being on the same line. I'll have to think on it. Maybe I'm more ambivalent toward it than I was first thinking. So that's interesting. So goblins not only have a bonus action and actions, they have a reaction. And not every creature has a reaction or a bonus action, but you know, there was a project I did once for myself where I basically went through the SRD. And it was because in The Witcher 3, there's a game mechanic about decoction. So there's an alchemy, you know, inventory crafting system. And one of the things you can do are create decoctions. So, you know, if you have a basilisk decoction, that's going to give you a different benefit than, I don't know, a griffin decoction. So I was like, just as a thought experiment, I went through the SRD and created a bunch of decoctions. And the more I looked at it, the more I was like, a lot of these monsters are the same. You know, you have some that stand out, like a banshee instead of a ghost, or like an Umber Hulk, you know, where you can avert your gaze to not get confused. But for the most part, they were kind of the same, with very minor differences. So it is kind of cool to see that, like, the action economy of a goblin is significantly different than the action economy of a bugbear. They're not just both humanoids that have different numbers. In the way that they fight, in the way that they act, there is a noticeable mechanical difference, and I can commend Kobold Press for that kind of design. I'm not sure this is the best design. I would definitely still go about modifying it. I think this is a great start, though, especially in comparison to the previous 2 playtest packets we got. So this is another one that stood out to me while I was skimming, which is the Harpy. And that the Harpy has a doom point. Like, it's not really, I don't think of Harpies as a boss monster, but it's cool to see that they have a doom point option. That in addition, instead of Canticle of Thunder, maybe they make you do the Alluring Song save with disadvantage. I think this whole doom point system, I think there's definitely something there. And I would definitely use this Harpy over the Monster Manual one or the SRD one. So yeah, we're about halfway through, you know, scrolling down. A Mechadron, Living Constructs. So basically a Modron, but slightly different name. Yeah. So, just gonna see if there's anything else that really stands out to me. The Ochu. Yeah, nothing really stood out there. Other Rust Monster variant. So yeah, in terms of just overall design, the thing that's always bothered me about the Kobold Press's, like, messaging approach surrounding Project Black Flag is, to be honest, the arrogance, where they're like, you know, we're going to create a better system. We're going to create a more, all right. I can understand them wanting to create a more open system. I can understand them saying the OGL thing really freaked us out. We want to create our own system so that we have more control over it, that, you know, we're not depending on the whims of this other company for us to make the cool things we like. Rather, it was like, we can definitely do this better. And for the first 2 playtest packets, I do not think they achieved that. I think that it was interesting to read, but it wasn't anything I was blown away by. I'm not blown away by this, but I can see, having worked with the SRD a lot myself, that I can see where they started from and some of the adjustments they made. And I like this design direction. Doom points in particular, I think, is the smart way to go. I think, getting rid of the extraneous information, like the monster's hit dice or ability scores, making stealth and perception static scores, I can get behind that. I'm ambivalent toward keeping damage and condition immunities, like, in the same place. I think that it's all right to separate those, but that's not going to make or break it. And also, I prefer randomized damage as opposed to static damage. So instead of, you know, the troll here, the bite is, 9 piercing damage. I would rather it say, I don't know, 2d6 plus 1 or whatever, however it works out. But overall, what I like that they're doing is examining it from an action economy perspective, and I could see these being more exciting combats than just what exists in the SRD. That being said, Wizards of the Coast's design direction is also not stuck in the 2014 SRD. If you look at Multiverse of Madness, those designs are very, very different from the original Monster Manual. So I do think that it'll be interesting to see how they design things in the future. But overall, I say I mostly like what I'm seeing here. I think that this is the first playtest packet where I'm once again at least interested to see where it goes. Am I super excited about it, and am I like championing Valiant over 1D&D? No, still not. But, you know, especially for any GM, I do think that it's healthy to look at what other games are doing, and seeing if it makes sense to somehow integrate good ideas into your home game. I know a lot of GMs are big on homebrew. That's a thing. A good example I can point to from 1D&D is the Sorceress Burst cantrip, where there's an exploding die mechanic. You can talk about all you want about it's not an optimized spell. There are like better options that you could take, but in terms of a unique mechanic, they certainly did that with Sorceress Burst. So, I want to know what you guys think. What do you think about this design? Do you think it's different enough that you're intrigued to you? Oh, I see that they have some HP threshold, like bloodied actions. That's interesting. You know, let me know in the comments down below. And have an awesome day, everybody. Bye-bye now.